we're going to start talking about points, plotting in points. Now we're going to call this, for my example here in question number 1, I'm going to plot in 3 points. So at this point, I call them Q, R, and S, so we could refer to each of them by name. Now, each of my points has 2 values. We call this usually the order paired, right? Pair means 2, order that it's in order. What we do is that inside the parentheses, the first value is my X value, and my second number is my Y value. Think of it as alphabetical order, right? X comes before Y. So like I said, that's what we call this the ordered pair. So let's take a look at my first point. I'm going to call it Q just so as for us to practice. On the homework, you might just have to plug in 1 point, but in the notes, I want to plug in more than 1. Like I said, I want us to practice. So it says my X value is 0. So you guys can see this. My X value is 0. My Y value is -1. Now there's 2 lines that are very important in our graph here. Let me highlight them. This one down here, usually we put it a little darker. Notice how it has an X next to it. We call that the X axis. So that line is very important. And then this vertical line down here in the center, we call that the Y axis. The axes are very important. Now, what we mean is imagine that on the X axis, imagine 0. So it will be here. And then on the Y axis is -1. So if you look at 0 and -1, I want to know where is it that they meet, and it will be here. For right now, let me call this my point Q. Okay, so X is 0. So if you see it, it's right on the X axis, I choose 0. On the Y axis, I choose -1. And I want to see where did they meet. Another example, let me take a look at my point R. I'm going to use blue for us to represent. My X value is -2. My Y value is 1. So on the X axis is a -2. On the Y axis is +1. They will meet right here. One clear example is when we buy tickets, right? When we go to a concert, a game, or something where it's assigned seating, right? First, we have to find a section. We find a section, it's a number, but usually there's like a row and a number, right? You could say row C, seat number 4. So we have to find the row and the seat. The same thing here. First on the x-axis, I find -2 for my point R. On the x-axis, I find -2. And then on the y-axis, I find +1. And then right where they meet, that happens to be my point. Right on the x-axis, you guys see there's -2. On the y-axis, you guys see it's +1. Like I said, right where they meet, that's the point that I'm looking for. One last example in this question. Let me look at my point S. My x value is -3. My y value is 3. So on the x-axis, you guys see is -3. On the y-axis is +3. Now the point where they both meet, that's my point S. Again, I label them Q, R, and S so we could see which one is which. But on your homework, you're just going to have to plug in 1 point. So don't worry about the naming. All right, let's take a look at question number 2. Let me move back to red here. My first point, my x value is -3. My y value is 0. So on the x-axis, I find -3. On the y-axis, I find 0. The point where they meet, that's my point I. Let me do in blue, my H point. My x value is -3. So on the x-axis, I'm going to find -3. My y value is +1. So on the x-axis, I see -3. On the y-axis, I find 1. So let me call this my point H. And lastly, my point G, my x value is -2. My y value is -1. So I see on the x-axis, there's -2. On the y-axis, there is -1. The point where they meet, that's my point G. For your homework, you just have to move the point right where it goes. Okay, now let's also take a look at question number 3 and 4. The axis, the x-axis, the y-axis, let me highlight them again. Let me look at number 3. This is my x-axis and this is my y-axis. We're going to be able to find the coordinates of each point. I'm going to ask you for a few things here. 1, state the coordinates of each point. And then 2, state the quadrant or axis that a point is on. All right, so first of all, let me worry about the coordinates, okay? So let me answer this in, let me go in red for the answer. I'm just going to answer the coordinates. I'm going to deal with 3 examples here. Per question, there's 3 points. Your homework, you only have to deal with 1 point. In fact, I want to deal with 3. So the coordinates of C. My coordinates of C. I'm going to label the point C so you guys can see it. I see on the x-axis is +5. On the y-axis is +1. I want to see the value on the axis of my point C. My x value is 5. My y value is 1. So I'm going to write this inside parentheses. I'm going to write 5, 1. We usually separate it with a space after the comma. Sometimes we don't. It's basically how you feel like typing them. But my 2 values are 5, 1. Okay, 5, 1. My first value has to be the x-axis. The order the number matters. If I write the value is 1, 5, so let me just write 1, 5. That is incorrect. It is 5, 1. The order matters. Okay, so first the x value, then the y value. That's why we call this order pair, right? The numbers come in order. X and y, think of them in alphabetical order. All right, now what if I wanted to look at my point D? Because I'm just looking at the coordinates now. On the x-axis, D is -5. On the y-axis, it is -1. So I'm going to write this as -5, -1. So the order matters. X value first. And then what if I'm looking at my point E? On the x-axis is -3, right? I mean, we're going to draw a big line so we can see it. The x-axis is -3. On the y-axis is -4. So my coordinates are going to be -3, -4. Except the x value first. That's why we call this order pair. So don't forget alphabetical order. Then the next thing I'm going to ask you guys, let me cover these examples here. The next thing I'm going to ask is state the quadrant or axis that a point is on. Okay, now my axis, we already talked about the axis, like the x-axis, the y-axis. Now the interesting part of my axis is that it breaks my graph into 4 regions. I'm gonna call on the top right, I'm gonna call this my quadrant 1. I'm gonna use the Roman numerals 1. And I'm gonna use Q for quadrant. Quadrant, you guys have heard quad. Quad, the bikes that have 4 tires. Quad means 4. So quadrant, I broke this into 4 spaces. So I'm gonna call this quadrant 1. And then I'm gonna travel counterclockwise. So not the way the clock goes, the other way. I'm gonna call this section right here my quadrant 2. I'm gonna call this my quadrant 3. And I'm gonna call this my quadrant 4. Right, again, I'm using my Roman numerals. Okay, so let's see. We have to give the coordinates of each point. We have to give the quadrant or axis that a point is on. Coming back to point C, I look at my point C. That is in quadrant 1. So I'm going to say C is located in quadrant 1. Looking at my point D, you guys see where point D is? That one is located in quadrant 3. And then point E, that one also happens to be in quadrant 3. Now let's take a look at question number 4. In red, let me find my coordinates. Again, in your homework, you're gonna deal with just 1 point at a time. Here, for the example, I wanna do 3 points at a time. So I have my points U, V, and W. Okay, looking at my point U, I see the X value is 5. Let me draw a big line right here. My X value is 5. My Y value is -3. So my coordinates of U are going to be 5, -3. You guys see my X value is 5 and my Y value is -3. Now let me take a look at my coordinates of V. My X value, I cross the X-axis at 0. And then my Y value is going to be -3. So see where the point is, I made like a, if you guys want to call this like a cross, I just saw I said my X value is 0, because look, I crossed my line, I crossed it at the X-axis, I crossed it at 0. And my Y-axis, I crossed it at -3. So that's how I know my values. Let's take a look at W, my last point. I'll make a cross on that point. Right, for me to know the X value, look at the X-axis. What's the value on the X-axis where I crossed this? And I'm like, well, it's 1. On the Y value now, look at the Y-axis. What's the value where I cross the Y-axis? I'm gonna say, well, it's -1. So my coordinates are 1, -1. Okay, so the coordinates are not too difficult. Now let me see my quadrant. Remember, this is quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. And obviously the X-axis and the Y-axis. So my point U, U happens to be on quadrant 4. My point V, you guys see my point V is right here. Now, imagine you have a neighbor, right? And there's a fence between you and your neighbor. What if you get stuck on the fence? That kind of looks like my point V. Are you on your house or are you in your neighbor's house? You're basically stuck in the middle. So people will say, well, you're stuck on the fence. Same thing here. My point V is in between quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So it's not really in quadrant 3. It's not really in quadrant 4. It's right in the middle. Now, right in the middle, like the fence, as I mentioned, you getting stuck on the fence, it's that. I highlighted in yellow our fence. Now, the name of that, we call that the Y-axis. So my point V is not on a quadrant. It happens to be on an axis, in this case, the Y-axis. Now, my last point, my point W, this one happens to be on quadrant 4. Let me zoom out so you guys can see what we did today.